Brazil.
So, Brazil. So let's go a little bit back anyway, because I saw something in the Magid last night, actually this morning, that I wanted to go over. So he said, "Vezot yasim ha'adam elibo v'yitorer ba'ava gdola me'od." You know that? This is before. Shelo lachshov shum ratzon b'inyaнаv. He says that in order to awaken this great love for God, so the trick is not to think about your needs, your wants. And that's a famous thing in Chassidus. To not daven, to not pray for your needs, but rather to pray for the needs of the Shekhinah. And it's always a piece of advice that's repeated in Chassidus, that when you daven, not to daven about yourself. And that's called not thinking about your needs, but thinking about Ratzon Shamayim, what Hashem needs. And what does it mean that Hashem needs? Hashem's not needy. Is he needy? So what does it mean? Hashem has one need.
He needs our love and affection. He needs our care. He needs our...
So he needs one need. He has one need. The one need that he has is that there be human beings that do what he wants. That's the only need. And that he impressed into creation. Again, he himself, really doesn't need anything. But the way that he created the world is that would be the need that he would seem to have. That he needs us to do so and so. And again, why does he need us to do so and so? So you can see, like by idolatry, that's an abomination of this idea that you come and you say that if I bring this God with a lowercase g, this idol, I bring him a sacrifice. He needs the sacrifice. He needs to eat, drink, whatever, and therefore I will receive something back from him. So that's an abomination of this idea, because what are you imagining? You're imagining God is like you. Do people? You could ask this. Does anyone need? When you say that the idol needs to eat and drink, you're projecting from yourself. I need to eat and drink, so probably the idol also needs to eat and drink. Or in any case, even if I don't know what it really needs, maybe it's not in the form of physical food and drink, but this is a metaphor for it. So maybe they do the same thing. But the idea that what God needs from me is for me to willingly do what he wants, mitzvos, that I think has no counterpart anywhere. That and again, the stress is on willingly. The whole problem with the sacrifices, right? Even if you talk about Avram bringing Yitzchak, so the sacrifice, the test was Avram convincing his son to willingly offer himself as a sacrifice. That was the test. It wasn't just the test of having to. Obviously, it was also very hard to actually slaughter him. But the real test was, what you could say, was by Isaac, because he had to willingly accept the idea of being a sacrifice. That's very, in a sense, liberating, because not for Isaac, but the idea that we have to willingly do this, meaning give up my wants in order to do his wants, that is free will. That's the notion behind free will. So this is very much a cornerstone of what it means to serve God. That if I'm able to give up my needs in general, and to say, I want to do what does God need from me? He needs me to willingly give up my needs. Why? So according to what we've been explaining, that is the stepping stone or the ladder to get to the unchanging aspect of reality. You can't get to the unchanging aspect of reality if you cling to your needs, because your needs are impermanent. They're constantly changing.
What?
They're not permanent.
Okay.
They're dynamic. They keep changing. So if I'm locked into my
Aren't they basically
needs,
the same always?
what?
Aren't your needs basically the same always?
No, they change from day to
Be
day.
well and healthy and rich, you know. That's what most people
But that's not needs. That's not getting down into the details. The details change all the time. But by Hashem, the details don't change. That's the whole idea, that the Torah is unchanging. At most, you could say that I uncover details that I didn't know until now. But it's not that they weren't there all the time, I just didn't know about them. So it's just Helem V'Gilui, it's just revelation. It's not real change. The Torah is not really changing. It's being applied in new places and so on, maybe, but it's not changing. The principles have always been there, and even the details have always been there. It's just that we haven't uncovered them. But when it comes to a human being, our needs are constantly changing. And so I'm locked into a consciousness of change. But when I think about Hashem's need, which has always been just one thing, what does Hashem want? He wants me to be willing to abandon my needs and willingly do. In the end, he needs my free will. Really, that's what he wants.
Right. And then that's only for your good anyway.
And in the end, I'm the one who benefits from it. But that's besides the point. But the point is, okay. So, in the Maggid brings this very interestingly. He says that this is what it means that Vayetze Moshe Vayar et Echav. That when Moshe Rabbeinu grew up and he went out to see his brethren, what happened? Until then, up until that time, he was in a state of, you could ask, until age 20, let's say he was 20 or 40, we don't know exactly when. But until age 20, everything was fine and dandy? You didn't know people were suffering around you? It's like a question. You suddenly became a big humanitarian and you went out to see if your brethren are suffering? Well, what did you do until now? Mm-hmm. Oh, you enjoyed the palace.
Life in the palace.
Okay, and well, so he says, no, you have to look at it a little bit more spiritually. The story is a story, but what it signifies is that the tzaddik is a person who initially doesn't understand the suffering in the world. He really doesn't understand. The Torah in and of itself is not applied to reality. In the same way that the tzaddik doesn't understand the suffering. There's no connection to reality. To come out of its pristine state, there has to be an action done. And that action is Vayetze Moshe. Moshe came out and he went to see his brethren. And that's exactly what he's discussing here about the Torah. The Torah as it is before Hashem is not involved in the limited needs of human beings, in the limited situations of human beings. You have to take it out of where it was. That's why we start with this question on Sunday. That's why on the one hand it says Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. It says Hashem said to Moshe. That's the pristine Torah in its, call it unrelatable form, where it cannot be applied to what we do. And then Vaydaber Moshe el Bnei Israel, and then Moshe spoke to the children of Israel. That's Moshe coming out. That's Moshe taking it down. And that is always done, he says, the Maggid says, with Chochmah. Moshe Rabbeinu was Chochmah. That's the Ma. That's the ability to come out of your, call it your autistic state.
Shell.
Out of your shell. Shell is like a klipa, so it's not such a good word, but it's out of your disconnect, out of your dissonant state, where you don't see the suffering, where you don't see reality, where you're not connected to reality, and then you enter into reality. And when you enter into reality, that's already Moshe who gives the Torah. That's why there has to be someone who gives the Torah, because if the Torah was just as Hashem would give it, then it would be like the supreme will. There would be no change. There would be no ability to apply it to our reality. It would stay incoherent to a certain degree. So you always have to have someone bring it down. Okay, but that's the main thing, that you have to. So he says when you daven, for instance. So when you daven, davening is meant to go to that level, to that pristine state. So when you daven, and if you listen to the words of davening, they're descriptions of what Hashem does. They're not ever particular. They're never detailed. Like I say, Rofeh Cholei Amo Yisrael. You heal the sick of your people. We're not going down into details, this person, that person, from this sickness, that sickness, it doesn't matter. It's just a description that's what Hashem does. That's like entering into the pristine state. But after you finished the pristine state, that you understand that this is something that Hashem, this is how the divine will works. This is Hashem's will, that he wants to heal. He wants to heal the sick. Once I've davened that way, I can bring it down. But I have to first connect to a place where it's just a description of the world. And it's all ta'anug. It's the biggest pleasure in the world. It's the biggest pleasure in the world to heal someone who's sick. And it has to feel like pleasure. It can't feel like some kind of pain. But once I enter that, I can come down into our reality. And in our reality, there's Shloimeh ben whoever, and he needs refuah now. Okay? So you have to go to...
Reality is not a real reality anyway.
It's not that it's not real. It's just as real. It says Bereshit Bara. It's a real reality. The world of Bria is real. It's not that it's not real, but it's not the pristine state. It's a state where things change. We're constantly changing. The truth is not easy to define, and it keeps eluding you. Okay, so now let's go to V'zeu leman tiyeh torat Hashem b'ficha kivirat chazaka utziacha. So now he's coming back to the pasuk that we started with. Perush dechol makom shenemar yad eino el yamin. We said what are these verses? What are these verses talking about? They're talking about tefillin, right? Where's the chumash? We put it aside. V'yalecha leot al yadcha. It should be a sign on your hand, on your arm. Ulezikaron b'neinecha, and a remembrance between your eyes. Leman tiyeh torat Hashem b'ficha, so that the Torah of God be in your mouth. Ki v'yad chazaka hotziacha Hashem mimitzrayim, because with a strong hand, God took you out of Egypt. So what do you understand in this verse? That the hands are the same. It should be on my hand, because Hashem took me out with a strong hand.
So therefore there's also a weak hand.
That's a whole different question. Why do we, in the end, the strong hand is always the yamin, as we'll see in a second. Hashem took me out with a strong hand. That refers to the right. The right is strong. The left is weak. So why do we put tefillin on the left hand? That we learn from a different time, when it appears again. And there it says yadcha with a hey. Yud Dalet Chaf Hey, instead of the way that we write it, Yud Dalet Chaf. So Chazal learned from that. Why is it with a hey? Yad Keha. So the Kaf Hey is like to say Keha. Keha is weak. Like Ko, like the same way when we say, thus said Hashem. That's a weak saying. It's not like saying like Moshe Rabbeinu said, this is what God said. Zeh hadavar shel tzivah Hashem. Ko amar Hashem is like saying weakly. I'm not 100% sure that this is what he said. He said something like this. Okay, cool, something like this. So there's a connection here between he took me out with a strong hand. So I put the sign, the phylacteries, the tefillin, on my hand also to recall that. So and this leads to it, Torah being in my mouth. Why? So he says, Ki beyad chazaka utziacha perush dechol makom shemar yad eno el yamin. Whenever it mentions stam, just a generic arm or hand, it's talking about the right. Shehu rachamim, which is with mercy, with compassion. V'ne'emar, and it says in our parsha, V'avarti ve'eretz Mitzrayim, I will pass through the land of Egypt. And we know what does avarti in the Magid's world, in the Alter Rebbe's world mean, like ovrei retzono, that they pass over, they skip over. Okay, v'avarti is like to skip. Perush she'evir al midotav, that he skipped over his attributes. God skipped over his attributes. Okay, he did bittul. She'asa dinim b'Mitzrayim af al pi shemidotav l'rachem u'leitiv l'puav. Why? Because in order to plague the Egyptians, he had to skip over his compassion. He had to ignore his compassion. So that was the Yad Chazakah. That was the strong hand. The strong hand, you think, was how he hurt them. No, the strong hand, the right side, was to hold himself back. Hold back his compassion. And he did all this, why? Because he loves the Jewish people and wants to take them out of Egypt.
Compassion for the Egyptians.
Because he has compassion for all creation. What did he create creation for? To destroy it.
He did that once.
Back then he didn't have compassion, you're right. That's really what he had to do. Okay, it was a nicham libo. It was a very, very difficult thing. But he vowed to never do that again. So the default is that there has to be compassion. So how can you come? And you could also ask, what in the world does some 2-month-old baby have to do with the Jewish people being enslaved in Egypt? What did he do? To strike all the firstborn, he had to ignore his compassion. It's very, very simple. And like we said, he does all that. He skips over, meaning he ignores his infinite nature, and his infinite nature is to have compassion. He ignores it because of his love for the Jewish people. Kemashal ha'av, like we said before with the father. בעבור אהבתו שרוצה לעשות חסד עם בנו, כובש חסדו וכועס על אחרים ומצערים את בנו. So because he loves his son, so he's very strict with other people who are hurting his son. Even though his nature is to be compassionate. Even though maybe his son is even to blame, who knows. But still, since they're hurting him, so he goes out and he ignores his compassion and he lashes out at them, at whoever these people are. That's what Hashem did with the Egyptians. This is what it means that the strong hand was the right. הייתה כבושה בכדי להוציאה ממצרים. והיה שינוי שלא על פי טבע, ולכן תהיה תורת השם בפיך לעשות רצונך כרצונו. So just as Hashem exercises strong hand with his compassion, what does it mean? The compassion, and here this is the chap. The compassion is usually the right hand. And the right hand is always extended. The right is always extended out in greeting. But he held back his right hand. That's what it means, a strong hand. That he held back his right hand. And therefore, you too should hold back your needs. And go up to the level of the pristine will of God, where there's no needs. There's none of my detailed needs, none of my dynamic, changing personal needs. Just Hashem's need that I willfully do this, that I willfully accept His will, the divine will. And thanks to that, Hashem does something for you. What does He do for you? Then the result is that you have the Torah of Hashem in your mouth. Because again, the Torah of Hashem in your mouth is Hashem coming down from the pristine Torah into the oral Torah. That's like, again, that Hashem said to Moshe, and then Moshe Rabbeinu could say to the Jewish people. When Moshe says it to the Jewish people, it's already Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's already oral Torah. It's already applied to the world. It's not the Torah in its pristine state, which is not interested in our needs. It's not even applicable, maybe. Very hard to apply it. Same thing happens to you, that the moment that you are willing to abandon your needs and go up to the pristine will, when you come down, you receive the Torah in your mouth. And the Torah in your mouth is the ability to apply the Torah in reality. So what does that mean literally? Well, it's a little figuratively, but it's literally, says the Maggid. The Maggid says it means that you can change reality. Because that's what Torah is. Torah that's in the mouth is the Torah that can change reality. The Torah that's only in the pristine state has nothing to do with reality, so it can't change it. He says that's where you get the power to change reality. So some people will hear this and they'll say, it's a magical power. It's some kind of hocus pocus. You get a power in your mouth to say abracadabra, I don't know, something like that. It could also just be that from the Torah, like the Baal Shem Tov would look at a book and then he would know what the right eitzah is. He would know what the right advice is. He would know how to conduct things properly. But he got it from the Torah. And how did he get it from the Torah? Because he went up to the pristine Torah. He went up to the Torah as it is, disconnected from the world, before the world, as it were. And when he comes back down, Vayetze Moshe, it's the wisdom, it's the Torah in the mouth, it's all this. He has a piece of advice to give somebody that's based on Torah, that's based on bringing it down into the world and affecting the world. In the same way that the Torah was able to create the world, it can also, when you bring it down, it can change the world. It can't create it, maybe, but it can change it. If you want to create it, you have to go back to the pristine Torah that created the world. This Torah, the one that you're following what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. That's Torah Shebaal Peh. Torah Shebaal Peh is Amar Malka V'Akar Torah. That's the idea here. That the Torah Shebaal Peh is the Torah that's applied. Otherwise, it's not applied. It's not, again, in the pristine Torah, everything's fine. Everything's perfect. You don't have to do anything. It's just a description. Again, it's like looking at reality as just a snapshot. It's fine. Nothing wrong with this picture. That's the feeling of the pristine Torah. The Torah that comes down, Torah Hashem Beficha, that's already the Torah that changes reality, that plays the game of change, and says that the way things are, it's not fine. They need to change. And that's a Torah that has a impact on reality. And since everything emanates from his simple will, and when he says simple will, he means the pristine will, the will that's above reality. Hashem had to, we already said this, he's just repeating it. Hashem had to hold back the infinite and be imbued and engarbed in the finite, so that the world could accept it. Okay? The world of change could now accept something that's coming in small doses. Sometimes it says, God said to Moshe. This is why sometimes it says, God said to Moshe. It tells us before Moshe Rabbeinu told us, Vayodaber Hashem and Moshe. Sometimes it says that, or Vayomer Hashem and Moshe. And sometimes it's just Vayodaber Moshe el Bnei Israel. And sometimes it just skips directly to Moshe saying to us. Ufam lo ne'emar amirat Havai el Moshe, el amirat Moshe elam. Sometimes it just skips to Moshe Rabbeinu telling us. It doesn't mention that he received it from Hashem. Why? Because when Moshe Rabbeinu speaks, kfi koach ve'yicholet ha'am shichlu lekabel, kach tzimtzem et atzmo. Sometimes we get to hear that when Hashem spoke to Moshe, he already gave him the power. That's like it's saying, that he spoke to him because he's speaking to him in the pristine Torah. Okay? And Moshe Rabbeinu has to take that and limit it and bring it into our reality. But sometimes it tells us that Hashem did that for him. Okay? In most cases, it doesn't tell us. But in some cases, it says that this power that Moshe Rabbeinu had, he had from Hashem. Vayomer Hashem and Moshe, not Vayidaber Hashem and Moshe. We have to once talk about the differences between Vayidaber Hashem and Vayomer Hashem. They're a little bit different. But in any case, when it says Vayomer Hashem and Moshe, like it says in this parsha, again, in chapter 13, verse Aleph, in the first verse, Vayidaber Hashem and Moshe Leimor. Here it says Vayidaber Hashem and Moshe. Kadesh li chol bechor Peter korechem. Does it say again? No, it doesn't say again. It's interesting that here he says Vayomer Hashem Moshe, but really in the pasuk it says Vayidaber Hashem Moshe. So maybe he doesn't hold by the difference. There is a difference between when you say it like this and when you say it like that. But I'm sure he knows, but maybe here it's not relevant. Kach tzimtzem et atzmo. The same Hashem, in this case, he was the one who limited himself, meaning that the first time that we got a mitzvah, well, it's not exactly the first time. The first time was Hachodesh Hazeh in chapter 12, and there
also got mitzvah.
And there it says Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. So that's what he means. He's talking about chapter 12, verse 1. Here it says Vayomer Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor. He said to Moshe and to Aaron, and that's where he says Vayomer. Hachodesh hazeh lachem taram 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 dabru el kol adat Yisrael lemor, and so on. And then after he's finished with this, when he's Vayikra Moshe lechol ziknei Yisrael vayomer aleim, and then Moshe Rabbeinu relates everything that God said to him. So he says, when the Torah tells you that Hashem said this to Moshe, so Hashem did, he came down from his pristine state to give a detailed mitzvah. But otherwise, it's like the Moshe Rabbeinu has to do this work. That's how I understand it. והכל גלוי וידוע לפניו באיזה אופן יוכל לצמצם בכדי שיוכל העולם לסובלו. And Hashem knows what is the right way for him to contract himself so that the world can accept, so that changing reality can accept his words. So we have this is very, I mean, it's not as developed as it was after Loshen and Liadi, but it's certainly very developed. He says here that there are two types of love. There's the love that's constant and the love that's changing. Right? Avak hamayim, avak ha'esh. Love like water, we said yesterday, is love that is constant. Love like fire is love that's changing. And the same thing in the Torah. In the Torah, there's the Torah as it's unchanging, and that's the way that's before Hashem. And there's the Torah the way that it is changing, the way that the Moshe Rabbeinu brings it down. And he says, but sometimes there's a middle ground. The middle ground is when it says, Vayomer Hashem and Moshe, when Hashem says to Moshe. So Hashem himself is doing some level of tzimtzum here. He's doing some kind of bringing it down himself from the pristine state. And that's what he did. The first time that he gave a mitzvah, that you could say that's the big chap of a mitzvah. That the very first time that God gave a mitzvah in chapter 12 of Exodus, he did it in such a way that he himself was the one who limited his will in order to say something very specific, very exact in the mitzvah. But usually we don't hear that Hashem did that. Usually it's Moshe Rabbeinu who does that part. So,
yeah.
and we also learned how to daven. When you daven, you have to first of all connect.
Do that for the last 70 years.
So you first connect to the way it is pristinely. That this is how the picture of the world is, and it's fine. And then you can come down and change reality. Again, the change has to come as a second stage. And first you go into the static stage, and then you go into the changing state.
Okay.
So tomorrow we'll learn some Levi Yitzchak.
You want to send me an SMS or WhatsApp? Save me trying to work out how to spell well.